What would you do if your partner spent thousands on designer bags while you struggled to keep the lights on? Brandon's breaking point will leave you speechless. In the serene suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, Brandon Harper stepped into his modest two-bedroom home, shutting the door behind him with a quiet thud. The faint aroma of roasted chicken, seasoned with thyme and garlic, lingered in the air, but the house was unsettlingly silent. At 36 years old, Brandon's tall frame and broad shoulders carried the weight of a grueling day at the local assembly plant, where he had worked tirelessly for over a dozen years. His steel-toed boots scuffed the worn linoleum as he made his way toward the kitchen. There she was, Samantha Harper, his wife of nearly 7 years. At 34, Samantha exuded elegance, her caramel-brown hair tumbling in soft waves over her shoulders. She sat at the kitchen island, her perfectly manicured nails tapping rhythmically against the sleek surface of her new smartphone. She was browsing what appeared to be an upscale boutique's website, her attention fixed entirely on the glowing screen. "Hey," Brandon said, his voice warm but strained. His gray work shirt was streaked with oil and grime, mirroring the exhaustion etched into his features. Samantha murmured, her gaze never leaving the screen. Her hazel eyes, once alight with joy at his presence, now reflected the cold glow of the phone's light. Brandon set his lunchbox on the counter with a muted clatter and leaned against it, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I've been thinking," he started hesitantly, his voice cautious. "I'm going to skip overtime this week. I need to focus on that coding course I've been taking." Finally, Samantha looked up, her expression unreadable. "You're still on about this programming thing?" she asked, her tone laced with doubt. "Yeah," Brandon replied, nodding. "If I finish it, I can apply for better jobs. No more double shifts at the factory, and it pays a lot more." Samantha sighed, setting her phone down on the counter with a soft click. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she crossed her arms over the sleek blouse she'd bought from her favorite boutique, Magnolia Threads, just last month. "Brandon, that's great and all, but what about right now? Do you know how tight things are? And let's be honest, my friends," she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Brandon's stomach tightened. He knew where this was headed. "What about your friends?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Samantha shrugged, her gaze hardening. "They all have husbands who are doing better. Dylan started his own construction company, and Katie doesn't have to work at all. Meanwhile, you're stuck at the same plant you started at." Brandon's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I'm trying, Sam. I'm doing everything I can to build a better future for us." Samantha stood abruptly, smoothing the hem of her pencil skirt. "Trying isn't enough. The mortgage, the car loan, the credit cards, they don't wait for trying, Brandon." She turned to leave the room, but Brandon's next words stopped her in her tracks. "If you didn't spend so much money on," he cut himself off, shaking his head. "Never mind." "No, go ahead," Samantha snapped, turning back to face him. "Say it. Make this about me, about the things I buy. As if I don't need to keep up appearances." Brandon exhaled slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "It's not about appearances, Samantha. It's about keeping our heads above water. And right now, we're sinking." For a fleeting moment, her expression softened, but the hardness quickly returned. "You wouldn't understand. I can't just take any job, Brandon. I'm creative. I'm not built for a 9-to-5 grind." Brandon stared at her, the woman he had once dreamed of building a life with, now feeling like a stranger. He shook his head, grabbed his lunchbox, and walked to the guest room that served as his makeshift office. Shutting the door behind him, Brandon leaned against it for a moment, his head bowed. The hum of the aging desktop computer filled the small, cluttered room as he powered it on. The faint glow of the screen illuminated stacks of programming books and a half-empty coffee mug resting precariously on the edge of the desk. The course was challenging, but Brandon had been slowly making progress during late nights after grueling shifts at the plant. Tonight, however, the words on the screen blurred as Samantha's comments looped in his mind. "They all have husbands who are doing better." Brandon shook his head, trying to focus, but his thoughts kept wandering back to their early days. Samantha hadn't always been so focused on appearances. He remembered when they'd first moved into the house, her excitement about decorating the small space, the laughter they shared while assembling secondhand furniture. Back then, they would dream of a future built together, not dictated by expectations. The next morning, Brandon was back at the factory. The rhythmic clanking of machinery filled the air as he loaded heavy materials onto the conveyor belt. His back ached, his muscles protesting after years of repetitive labor. Yet he pushed through, the image of Samantha's disappointed gaze driving him to work harder. At lunch, Brandon sat alone in the break room, his sandwich untouched as he scrolled through a job posting board on his phone. One listing caught his attention: junior software developer, no experience required. His heart quickened. The pay was modest but significantly better than what he earned now. He saved the post and made a mental note to revisit it later. When his shift ended, Brandon lingered in the locker room, reluctant to return home to another argument. By the time he walked through the door, it was nearly dark. The house was eerily quiet, save for the soft sound of Samantha's voice coming from the living room. He rounded the corner and froze. She was on the phone, laughing softly. On the coffee table sat a shopping bag from Luxhaven, an upscale boutique downtown. The unmistakable shimmer of a designer handbag peeked out from the top. Brandon's chest tightened. He waited until Samantha hung up before stepping into the room. "Is that new?" he asked, gesturing toward the bag. Samantha glanced at it dismissively. "Oh, this? Yeah, but don't worry, it was on sale." Brandon's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "On sale?" he echoed, his voice rising. "Samantha, we're drowning in debt. You promised you'd cut back." Her expression hardened. "It's just a bag, Brandon. What's the big deal? I need to look presentable. What would people think if I didn't?" "People?" Brandon shot back. "What people? The same ones you're so busy comparing me to? Do you even care how hard I'm working to keep us afloat?" Samantha stood, her hazel eyes blazing. "Don't you dare put this all on me. Do you think I like having to stretch every dollar? To worry about whether we can afford decent clothes, a decent car? Maybe if you had more ambition, we wouldn't be in this mess." Brandon's patience snapped. "Ambition," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I'm breaking my back every day, so you can buy another bag we don't need. I'm trying to build something better for us, but all you care about is keeping up with people who don't even matter." Samantha crossed her arms, her voice icy. "Maybe if you were more like them, I wouldn't have to try so hard." Her words were a punch to the gut. Without another word, Brandon grabbed his jacket and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The crisp evening air stung his face as he strode aimlessly through the quiet streets of Charlotte. Brandon found himself at Freedom Park, one of the places he used to visit with Samantha when they first moved to Charlotte. He sat on a bench near the pond, watching the rippling water reflect the streetlights. A group of teenagers laughed as they passed by, their carefree energy a stark contrast to the storm raging in his mind. How did it come to this? He thought, his hands clenched into fists. He remembered giving up his dreams of finishing college when his mother's health deteriorated. The hospital bills piled up, and Brandon had taken a job at the factory to cover the expenses. When she passed, he thought he might finally have a chance to get back on track. But life didn't work that way. Samantha came into his life soon after, her laughter infectious, her optimism a bright counterpoint to his practicality. They used to walk through this same park, dreaming of a future where they'd have everything they ever wanted. Yet, somewhere along the line, those dreams had been replaced by fights about money and appearances. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a notification for the coding course, another reminder of the opportunity slipping through his fingers every time he let exhaustion or frustration get the better of him. Brandon took a deep breath, resolved to keep moving forward, no matter how hard it got. By the time he returned home, it was late. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the bedroom lights spilling under the door. Brandon stepped inside quietly, but the sound of Samantha's voice stopped him in his tracks. "I just don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," she said, her tone laced with frustration. "He's stuck, you know? I need someone who can actually provide, not just survive." Brandon's chest tightened. She wasn't on the phone. She was video chatting, her voice low, but not low enough to be missed. He stepped closer, careful to stay in the shadows. Through the crack in the door, he caught a glimpse of her screen. A man's face filled the frame. Sharp features, a confident smile, a neatly tailored suit. Brandon's stomach dropped. "Don't worry," the man said, his voice smooth and self-assured. "You deserve better, Samantha. And if he can't give you what you need, maybe it's time to move on." Samantha laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe you're right." Brandon couldn't listen anymore. He turned away, his heart pounding in his chest. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. But instead of confronting her, he went to the guest room and shut the door. He needed time to think, time to figure out his next move. The next morning, Brandon left the house early, determined to avoid Samantha. His mind raced as he drove to the factory, replaying the conversation he'd overheard the night before. It wasn't just the man on the screen. It was the way Samantha laughed, the ease with which she entertained the idea of leaving him behind. During his lunch break, Brandon found himself back in the office of Ryan Hale, a sharp-eyed divorce attorney recommended by one of his coworkers. Ryan listened intently as Brandon recounted the events of the past few months, from the mounting debt to the emotional distance, and now the discovery of Samantha's betrayal. When Brandon showed Ryan the photos he had taken of Samantha's shopping sprees and the brief screenshot of her video call, Ryan nodded approvingly. "This is a solid start," he said, his tone calm but assertive. "We can argue financial irresponsibility and emotional neglect. The video call adds weight, but we'll need more to make the case airtight." "What else do I need to do?" Brandon asked, leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly. Ryan slid a notepad across the desk. "First, open a separate bank account. Make sure your paycheck goes there starting immediately. Second, gather any and all financial records, credit card statements, loan agreements, receipts. Anything that paints a clear picture of her spending patterns. Lastly, if you can access her phone again, get evidence of that app or chat logs. Every detail matters." Brandon left the office with a renewed sense of purpose. That evening, while Samantha was out at one of her so-called networking events, he searched through their shared filing cabinet and the shoebox in the closet where she often stuffed receipts. Each discovery painted a damning picture. Extravagant purchases from Lux Haven, high-end spa treatments, and a custom diamond bracelet that he had never seen her wear. The numbers were staggering. In 1 month alone, Samantha had spent nearly $5,000, more than half of Brandon's monthly income. Later that night, as he was sorting through the documents, his phone buzzed. It was a notification from a coding job board he had signed up for weeks ago. A company was hosting a local hackathon, an event for aspiring developers to showcase their skills. The winner would receive not only a cash prize, but also a guaranteed interview for an entry-level position. Brandon stared at the screen. He didn't feel ready, but deep down, he knew this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. The following Saturday, Brandon woke before dawn. He had registered for the hackathon, arriving early to a downtown co-working space bustling with nervous participants. Most of them were younger than him, fresh out of college or tech boot camps, their laptops adorned with colorful stickers. Brandon felt out of place in his faded work jeans and plain gray hoodie. But as the competition began, his nerves steadied. The challenge was to build a functional app in 8 hours. Brandon focused on creating a simple budgeting tool, something he'd wished he'd had years ago to manage their finances. His hands moved instinctively over the keyboard, the long hours of studying finally paying off. By the end of the day, Brandon's app didn't just work. It impressed the judges with its practicality and clean design. When his name was announced as the winner, he felt a wave of pride and relief. For the first time in years, he felt like he was stepping towards something better. That evening, Brandon returned home exhausted but hopeful. Samantha was waiting for him in the living room, her arms crossed. "Where were you all day?" she demanded. "I was at an event," Brandon said evenly. He walked past her, heading straight for the guest room. Samantha followed, her voice sharp. "You could have at least told me. You've been so distant lately, Brandon. It's like you don't even care about this marriage." Brandon paused in the doorway, turning to face her. "Care about this marriage?" he repeated, his voice calm but firm. "Do you think I don't see what's happening, Samantha? The spending, the lies, the calls?" Her face paled for a moment, but she quickly recovered, rolling her eyes. "Oh, so you're spying on me now?" Brandon shook his head. "I'm done, Samantha. I'm not going to keep fighting for something you've already given up on." Without waiting for her response, he shut the door behind him. For the first time in months, he felt in control of his future. Over the next few days, Brandon threw himself into preparations for what lay ahead. He finalized the documents Ryan had requested, including receipts, bank statements, and even photos of Samantha's excessive purchases. Each piece of evidence painted a clear picture of her reckless spending and disregard for their financial situation. One evening, as Brandon sorted through another stack of papers, Samantha returned home earlier than expected. She walked into the guest room without knocking, her arms laden with shopping bags. "What's all this?" she asked, her tone suspicious as her eyes darted to the piles of documents on the desk. "Just organizing some paperwork," Brandon replied curtly, not bothering to look up. Samantha's brow furrowed as she stepped closer. "Why do you have all these receipts? Are you keeping tabs on me now?" Brandon sighed, setting down the folder in his hands. "It's not about keeping tabs, Samantha. It's about facing the reality you've been ignoring. We're in debt, and you're acting like money grows on trees." She scoffed, dropping her bags onto the floor. "Oh, please, don't act like this is all my fault. If you made more money, we wouldn't have these problems." Brandon met her gaze, his expression cold. "And if you stop spending every dollar we don't have, we might actually get ahead." The tension in the room was suffocating. Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line as she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Brandon exhaled deeply, shaking his head. He knew the confrontation had been inevitable, but it still left him feeling drained. A few days later, Brandon had his first meeting with Ryan and a financial examiner, who had compiled a detailed report on the couple's finances. The numbers were even worse than Brandon had anticipated. Samantha's spending over the past 2 years had exceeded $50,000, much of it on non-essential items like designer handbags, spa treatments, and luxury shoes. "This is more than enough to build a case," Ryan said, sliding the report across the desk. "We'll argue that her financial irresponsibility directly contributed to the breakdown of the marriage." Brandon nodded, his jaw tightening. "What about the house? I don't want to fight over it." Ryan leaned back in his chair, considering. "Given the state of your finances, it's likely the court will require the house to be sold to pay off the debts. But with the evidence we have, we can argue that Samantha should bear the majority of the financial burden." Brandon felt a pang of sadness at the thought of losing the home they had built together, but he knew it was a small price to pay for his freedom. That evening, Brandon came home to find Samantha dressed to the nines, a shimmering cocktail dress hugging her frame and diamonds glittering at her ears. The faint scent of expensive perfume lingered in the air. "Big plans?" he asked, his tone neutral as he set his keys on the counter. Samantha smirked, grabbing her clutch. "Just a networking event. You wouldn't understand." Brandon chuckled dryly, leaning against the doorway. "Networking, right?" Samantha's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Nothing. Have fun." As she walked out the door, Brandon's gaze lingered on her for a moment. He knew she wasn't going to a networking event. The man from the video chat haunted his thoughts, but instead of letting the anger consume him, Brandon focused on his plans. He had already taken the first steps to free himself from this toxic cycle, and he wasn't going to let her drag him down any further. The next morning, Brandon met Ryan to finalize the divorce papers. He signed each page with a steady hand, feeling the weight of the past few years begin to lift. When everything was ready, Ryan placed the stack of papers into a manila envelope. "This is it," Ryan said, his tone reassuring. "Once she's served, the clock starts ticking." Brandon nodded, his resolve firm. "Let's get it done." The day Samantha was served the divorce papers, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Brandon came home to find her pacing the living room, the envelope from Ryan sitting open on the coffee table. Her face was flushed, and her hazel eyes burned with anger. "What the hell is this, Brandon?" she demanded, holding up the papers. "You know exactly what it is," Brandon replied calmly, setting his keys down. "This has been a long time coming, Samantha. You're really going to throw everything away?" She shot back, her voice trembling. "After all we've been through?" Brandon crossed his arms, his expression resolute. "You threw it away, Sam. Every shopping spree, every lie, every time you put your image above our future. And then there's the dating app. Don't act like you didn't make this choice." Her face paled at the mention of the app, but she quickly recovered, her tone shifting to pleading. "I was just bored, Brandon. It didn't mean anything. We can fix this, go to therapy or something." He shook his head, his voice steady. "It's too late for that. I've given everything I had to this marriage, and all you've done is take. I deserve better." Samantha's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. But then her expression hardened again. "Fina, you want out? Go ahead. But don't think you're walking away clean. I've sacrificed for this marriage too." Brandon let out a bitter laugh. "Sacrificed? By spending thousands on handbags and spa days? Yeah, that's some real sacrifice." Before Samantha could respond, he turned and walked toward the guest room, shutting the door behind him. He didn't want to fight anymore. The papers were filed, and the process had begun. All that was left was to wait for the court to decide the final terms. Over the next few weeks, Samantha made half-hearted attempts to reconcile, but Brandon saw through her efforts. Her words were laced with the same manipulations he had grown accustomed to, and he refused to be drawn back in. Instead, he focused on preparing for his new life. One evening, Brandon received an email that stopped him in his tracks. The tech company hosting the hackathon had reviewed his app and was impressed. They wanted to schedule an interview for a junior developer position. His heart raced as he read the message, a glimmer of hope cutting through the chaos of his life. The interview was scheduled for the following week. Brandon spent every spare moment preparing, watching tutorials, practicing coding challenges, and refining his app. The night before the interview, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the tie he hadn't worn in years. He barely recognized himself. His face was thinner, his posture more confident. The morning of the interview, Brandon walked into the sleek office building, his nerves tingling with anticipation. The interviewer, a middle-aged woman named Jessica Hayes, greeted him warmly and asked him about his journey into programming. Brandon spoke candidly about his time at the factory, his late nights studying, and his desire to build a better life. Jessica listened intently, her expression softening as he described the budgeting app he'd created for the hackathon. By the end of the meeting, she smiled and extended her hand. "Welcome aboard, Brandon. We'll start you as a junior developer, but I have a feeling you'll move up quickly." Relief washed over him as he shook her hand. For the first time in years, he felt like his hard work was paying off. When Brandon returned home that evening, he found Samantha in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up as he walked in, her tone indifferent. "How was your day?" He paused, debating whether to tell her about the job. Finally, he simply said, "It was good," and headed to the guest room. He didn't owe her any explanations anymore. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, thanks to Ryan's meticulous preparation. The day of the hearing, Brandon sat in the courtroom, his shoulders squared and his gaze steady. Samantha arrived moments later, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy dress, her usual confidence replaced by visible unease. She avoided Brandon's eyes as she took her seat beside her lawyer. Ryan presented their case with precision, laying out Samantha's spending habits, the overwhelming debt she had accrued, and the evidence of infidelity. The financial report painted a stark picture. Tens of thousands of dollars squandered on non-essential items, while Brandon's modest income barely covered the essentials. When it was Samantha's turn to testify, her lawyer attempted to frame her spending as necessary for maintaining their household and keeping up appearances. But under cross-examination, Samantha's explanations faltered. Ryan's questioning was relentless, bringing up specific purchases and the dating app profile. The judge's furrowed brow deepened with each revelation. By the end of the hearing, it was clear which way the decision would go. The judge ruled that Samantha would assume responsibility for the majority of the debt, as her spending was deemed personal rather than for the benefit of the household. She was ordered to sell several of her luxury items, including handbags, jewelry, and even her beloved designer shoes, to cover the outstanding loans. As for the house, it was to be sold, with the proceeds split between them. However, Brandon's future earnings were protected, and he was absolved of any responsibility for Samantha's debts. The divorce was finalized that same day, leaving Samantha visibly shaken as she exited the courtroom. The weeks following the divorce were a whirlwind of change. Brandon threw himself into his new job as a junior developer, quickly earning the respect of his colleagues with his work ethic and problem-solving skills. The steady paycheck and the knowledge that he was building a better future brought him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. On the day he moved out of the house, Brandon paused in the empty living room, taking one last look around. The memories of laughter and love that once filled the space felt distant now, replaced by the echoes of arguments and disappointment. With a deep breath, he turned and walked out the door, leaving the past behind. Meanwhile, Samantha struggled to adjust to her new reality. Word of the divorce and her financial troubles spread quickly among their social circles, and the friends she had worked so hard to impress began to distance themselves. Forced to find work, she landed a job as a sales associate at an upscale boutique, spending long days on her feet catering to customers who reminded her of the life she had once flaunted. One afternoon, as she helped a woman select a designer handbag, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the store's polished glass. For the first time, she saw herself clearly, not as the polished, put-together woman she had always tried to portray, but as someone who had let her pride and insecurities destroy everything she had. 6 months later, Brandon's life had transformed. He had rented a small but cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood, where he spent his evenings hiking, reading, and catching up with old friends. The programming job had given him not only financial stability, but also a renewed sense of purpose. One crisp autumn morning, Brandon received an email from his supervisor. They were promoting him to a mid-level developer role, with a significant pay raise and more responsibilities. He smiled as he read the message, feeling a sense of accomplishment he hadn't known in years. On his last day of the factory, Brandon's former co-workers threw him a small farewell party, complete with homemade cupcakes and heartfelt goodbyes. Standing in the parking lot after the celebration, Brandon looked up at the clear blue sky, the crisp air filling his lungs. He had come so far, and there was still so much ahead of him. For the first time in a long time, Brandon felt free.